Hearing is now resumed. This hearing is now resumed.
Thank you. Mr. Barclay, the next witness is Natasha Schwint, who joins us by Zoom link. May I proceed with this witness?
Go right ahead.
Okay. Ms. Schwint, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yep.
Okay. Ms. Anderson, would you administer the oath or affirmation?
Thank you. Can you state your full name, please? Ms. Schwint, I think you're on mute.
Natasha Suzanne Schwint.
Are you swearing or affirming, ma'am?
I can swear.
Okay. Do you have a Bible there?
Oh, I'll affirm. I don't think I have a Bible in here.
Okay.
Affirms.
Okay. Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence that you will provide today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
That.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ms. Schwint. I'm going to be asking you questions, and then Mr. Cooper will have questions for you, okay?
Okay.
Okay. I'd like to begin, though, by informing you that pursuant to Section 8 of the Public Inquiries Act, you do have the right to object to answer any question under Section 5 of the Canada Evidence Act. The Public Inquiries Act also provides that any witness at an inquiry shall be deemed to have objected to answer any question asked of the witness on the grounds that the answer of the witness may tend to incriminate the witness or may tend to establish the liability of the witness to a civil proceeding at the instance of the Crown or any person. And no answer given by a witness at an inquiry shall be used or be admissible in evidence against the witness in any trial or other proceeding against the witness taking place after the inquiry, other than a prosecution for perjury in the giving of evidence. Do you understand that warning?
Yes, I understand.
Okay. I think you can leave your microphone on. Okay. that way we can communicate better. Now, you were questioned by me in advance of this hearing on Monday, November 27th, correct?
Yeah. Yes, I was.
Okay. And do you have your transcript?
I have it via a phone.
You have it on PDF on your phone?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like that transcript marked as the next exhibit. The witness interview of Natasha Schwint on Monday, September 27th, 2021 is the next exhibit.
Marked is Exhibit 26.
Exhibit 26. Now, Ms. Schwint, I understand that you were in a common law relationship with Mr. Steve Norn of Yellowknife, correct?
Yes, I was.
How long did that common law relationship last?
13 years we were together.
When did it start and when did it end?
You asked me. I'm not 100% sure on when it started, but September 2009, something along the lines of that, maybe. And we separated. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna turn something off on my computer. And then we separated around March 2020.
And do you have a child? Did you have a child together?
Yes, we have one daughter together.
And what is her name?
Her name is Cena, last name Norn.
And what is her date of birth?
August 31st, 2011.
I'm sorry, August 31st, what year?
2011.
Now, I ask you to turn your mind back to April of this year. Was Cine away from your house at that time?
Yeah, my daughter went on a ski trip with my parents down in British Columbia.
Okay. And who did she go with?
My mom and dad and my brother and his partner and my grandparents and my nieces and nephews.
Okay. And how did she get down, get to British Columbia?
She flew just to, I think they flew to Calgary on the way down, and then on the way back up, they flew from Edmonton.
Okay. How long was she gone?
About a week and a half.
When did she leave?
Whew.
Approximately.
April
Approximately.
8th, yeah. I don't know. 8 days before April 8th, so the end of
Okay.
March.
So,
End of March.
end of March. And so she returned. When did she return?
The April 8th.
April 8th. And did she return at the airport? Did she fly back?
Yes, she flew back
Okay.
from Edmonton, I believe.
I'm sorry, did you say they flew back?
She flew back by herself.
Okay. And did you pick her up at the airport?
Yes, I picked her up at the airport.
Okay, and that would have been on April 8th, correct? 2021,
Yeah.
correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, and did you go straight home from the airport on April 8th, 2021?
We, on our way home, stopped at Steve Norn's residence.
And what residence was that?
His house is on Williams Avenue, and it's like down the block from my house.
Right. And who did Mr. Norn live with at that residence?
At the Williams Avenue residence, he lived with his girlfriend, Trisha Smith.
Okay. And why did you stop at that residence? Or did you?
My daughter had been in BC for a while, and she hadn't seen her dad. And I thought that he had been in isolation for one day. And originally, we were just kind of doing a drive-by, like my daughter was going to wave at him, and that was the intent. But then during that interaction, he came outside, my daughter undid the window, and she kissed her dad.
Okay, so you were going to do a drive-by of the Williams house,
Yeah, just
correct?
to like wave and say hello,
Okay.
Most
And,
parents.
and,
want
so,
that.
and social distance.
Yeah.
Did you understand that since she had returned to the territories that she had to self-isolate?
Yeah, I knew that she had to self-isolate and that I had to isolate because she was isolating.
I'm sorry, you're trailing off a bit there, and that you had to self-isolate as well because you're going to be with her?
Yeah.
The answer is yes?
Yes.
Okay. And you were going to do a drive-by, but what happened? You stopped the vehicle?
Yeah, I stopped the vehicle and we undid the window, and then Cena called her dad over.
Okay. And so her father, Steve Norn, was outside?
Yes.
Okay. And Cena was in the front passenger seat?
Yes, Cena was sitting in the passenger seat of the vehicle.
How old was she? How old was she at the time?
9.
Okay. And so the window was put down by her or you?
Yeah, she put the window down.
Okay. And her father came over and did what?
And they just briefly kissed.
They kissed, you said?
Yeah, my daughter kissed him on the cheek.
Okay. And did Mr. Norn take down his mask then?
I don't remember the mask. I don't I don't have any, I don't think I was paying attention to whether or not the mask was on or off. I'm not really sure.
Okay. But did they also embrace? Did they hug?
No, it was more just like, I think just like a leaned in kiss and that or leaned out kiss, and that was it. It wasn't,
You don't remember if Mr. Norn leaned in or Cena leaned out?
it's kind of both of them, I would say. They leaned into each other. But she was definitely
Okay. And
partially out of the window. I
did they
don't
say anything?
think it was a hug though. I think it was
Okay.
just
Did they say anything between each other? Was anything said between each other?
just like, Daddy, I love you, I miss you. That's
Okay.
pretty
And
basic.
did Mr. Norn say anything?
Probably, I would imagine. I can't say for sure because I don't really, there was no reason to really like memorize every word that was said.
Oh,
But I would imagine that he said that he loves her and he missed her, that we'll see each other soon.
and how long did that interaction take?
We weren't there for longer than I want to say between 3 and 5 minutes.
Okay. Did Cena ever get out of the car?
No.
Okay. But the passenger side window was rolled down.
Yeah.
Okay. Did Mr. Norn say anything to you?
No.
Okay. So you thought he was in isolation at that time,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
How long did you think he'd been in isolation at that date, April 8th?
Only a day in between each other. That was my understanding.
Did that turn out to be correct? Did you understand it was different than that later?
Yes.
What did you find out later?
That they were home for 4 days, I think, or 3 or 4 days before Cena got home.
Yeah.
Something
You
like
thought
that.
their isolation was beginning at the same time.
I thought there was a 24-hour difference.
Okay. Okay. Now, did you self-isolate with Cena starting April 8th?
Yes.
Okay. And is that because she had returned from outside the province?
Yes.
Okay. And did you inform public health about this visit on April the 8th?
I don't think April 8th is when we told them. We told them when we were diagnosed with COVID and they wanted to do the contact tracing.
Right. Let me correct my question. Did you subsequently tell public health that you did, that Cena and you had this visit on April 8th?
Yes, we told them immediately.
Okay. And so how long would you say, there was going to be a drive-by, but you stopped. How long were you stopped in front, at the residence?
Not longer than 5 minutes, but definitely not shorter than 3. I would say that's like the best time span I can give you is between 3 to 5 minutes.
Were you on the driveway or on the public roadway?
On the public roadway.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to turn your mind to Saturday, April the 17th. Did you arrange for Mr. Norn to pick up something that day?
Yeah, Steve, well, yeah, Steve had messaged me and asked for a couple of his things from the house.
Okay, and was that on Saturday, April 17th he messaged you?
I don't know if it was this, yeah, I think the 17th, I'm guessing. I don't know the exact date that he messaged me, but I got everything together for him outside on the 17th.
Okay, and Was it personal matters, clothes, and that sort of
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah. He still
Okay.
has lots of stuff in my house.
And so how did you package it for him?
Oh, just in a duffel bag, like a travel
Okay.
bag.
And where did you put the duffel bag?
Outside.
Okay. When you say outside, I don't know your house. Does it have a porch or does
Yeah.
it have
Sorry. I
Okay.
have like an indoor porch and then I have an outdoor porch, kind of like where there's metal slabs, kind of like a walkway entrance into my house. So I put it's a, you can see all your neighbors kind of around in like a circle. And so no one steals anything in that area because everyone's watching everyone's property. So you can just put stuff outside and it never goes anywhere, thankfully. But so yeah, I just put it on the outside step entrance.
Okay. And did you see him pick it up?
No, I don't. Yeah,
Okay. But was it gone after you left it there?
yeah, definitely before midnight it was picked up.
Okay. So you don't know what time he picked it up?
No, I don't.
Okay. So, but it was definitely picked up on the 17th of April.
Yeah.
Okay. And if do you know if when he picked it up, Cena was there and saw him?
I mean, definitely we were in isolation, but we didn't see him that day. Like she didn't go outside and say hi to him or anything. No.
Yeah, but you didn't see him pick it up.
No, exactly.
So is it possible that he saw her, not you? He saw your daughter and not you when he picked up the bag?
No, my daughter and I kind of live upstairs and we have floors. And so she was upstairs crafting for sure the whole time we were in isolation. She didn't,
Okay.
there'd
But
be no
your
way
evidence
to
is
see
you
him.
never saw him pick it up.
No.
Okay. And at that time, what's the address of your residence?
So it's unit number 12496 Range Lake Road.
And does it have another street address besides that?
No.
Okay. Is it on Willowwood Court though?
Oh, yep. Willowwood Court. Yep.
Okay. And in relation to the residence of Tricia Smith, how far away is it?
We have a little bit of a hill, but not like a tiny hill, and then it would be 1 block down the street.
So is it you tell me a block and a half, 2 blocks?
I would say yeah, 1.5 blocks.
Okay. Now, you've told us about the April 8th drive-by that turned into a brief stopover, and you told us about the April 17th bag pickup, correct? Were there any other communications with Mr. Norn during that period of time in terms of physically being present at your
No.
residence or with you? Pardon me?
No, we didn't have any other contact during that period of time.
Okay. On the morning, early morning of April 15th, 2021, after midnight, did Mr. Norn come to your residence?
Not that I'm aware of. He didn't come into my house.
Okay. You say not that you're aware of, he didn't come into your house? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Does he have a key to your residence?
No.
Okay. Or did he have a key at that time?
No.
Okay. Now, you went into isolation with your daughter on April the 8th. Did you get tested for COVID-19?
Yeah, we got tested when the wastewater email came out, or message, and then we got an email from public health.
So was there a wastewater advisory message for the people of Yellowknife that if they had been self-isolating from April, a certain time in April, that they should get tested?
Yeah.
Okay. And so did you respond to that?
Yeah.
Okay. And so when did you get tested?
I don't know.
What is wastewater? You told us in your evidence before that you got tested April 22nd.
Yeah, it would have been around that time because I would have been done my isolation around that time. So it would have been the 8th.
Okay.
Yeah, close to that time.
I apologize for interrupting, but there does appear to be a couple of occurrences where the witness is referring to something off screen. In fact, early on, I noticed that she was typing. I'm not suggesting anything nefarious, but you may want to give her some caution or guidance with respect to that. It may be that she's just looking at her testimony, the exhibit, but we can't tell, and that's one of the weaknesses, of course, of remote hearings.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Could you tell us what you're referring to? Mr. Cooper has a valid point there.
I was just looking back at the calendar for April 2020.
Okay, so just a calendar, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And were you in, did Mr. Norn inform you that he had tested positive for COVID?
I don't remember when. I'm just trying to think, did I know about it before I went and got tested? I don't recall if I knew about his positive test yet. I may have already found out from him, but I may not have when I went to go get my test.
But is it your evidence that you think you were responding to the wastewater advisory?
Yeah, we were just doing what we were told to do.
Okay, so you went for a test on April 22nd. What about Cena?
Yeah, she got tested as well.
Okay, what were the results of your tests?
We both came back positive.
Both came back positive for COVID-19,
Yes.
correct? Okay, did Cena have to suffer any results as a result of acquiring that?
No, she was asymptomatic.
And what about yourself?
I was pretty sick.
Okay, and when did your sickness begin and when did it end?
I got sick a week after her return from the vacation, I would say around a week. And that lasted for 2 weeks.
For how many weeks?
2 weeks.
Okay. You weren't hospitalized?
No. Sorry.
But just let me check my notes, Ms. Schwint. Okay, yeah. What about the persons who accompanied Cena on the snowboarding or skiing trip? Did they test positive for COVID-19 to your knowledge?
So when I was just recently down in Regina, And obviously, COVID has ramped back up in your region, that area. And while I was there visiting my parents, we were talking about them being sick again because they both ended up getting sick again on this trip. Dawson, my nephew, and my daughter, they both ended up getting like a flu. And then my mom was like, oh, well, they've already had COVID. They had it back when they did the ski trip in March. And that was the first of my knowledge that they had tested positive for COVID. I wasn't aware that at that time that there was a potential connection of the COVID.
And what was that potential connection?
Well, if my niece and nephew had COVID during the same time that my daughter had COVID, there's a good chance that she was the one who had contracted it and passed it on to me.
Pass it on to you?
Yeah.
Okay. Those are all the questions I have for you. Mr. Cooper may have some questions. Thank you.
Mr. Cooper?
I'm going to mute this.
May I proceed? Mr. Adjudicator?
Yes, yes.
Go right ahead, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you. You may have responded, but you were muted. Another weakness of remote hearing such as this. Did anybody suggest to you that your contracting of COVID could be traced to anybody in particular, your daughter or otherwise?
Did anyone explain to me sorry, say that again.
It's awkwardly worded. Let me try that again. Did any of the authorities suggest that you had contracted COVID from any particular person?
No, they didn't tell us where it came from. They just said that it was positive, and we weren't sure where it had come from, really.
Your conclusion that it was likely your daughter was as a result of a fairly recent conversation you had with family in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, exactly.
When did that conversation take place?
Like a week and a half ago.
The only contact that you or your daughter had with Mr. Norn between the period of April 4 and April 18 was when he stopped, or you stopped at his house for a quick hello to his daughter.
Yes.
No other contact whatsoever between yourself, Cena, and Mr. Norn, correct?
Correct.
You had contacted Mr. Norn to let him know that you were going to come by for a quick drive-by?
Yes.
So he knew you were coming. Where was he when you arrived?
Out of his house already.
When was the last time he had seen his daughter before that?
Probably a couple weeks before that.
And before that 2-week period, how often did Mr. Norn see Cena?
I would say sporadically. There wasn't really, we don't have a plan in place for any custody at the moment. So she's full-time with me. And then when I need Steve, he steps up and does things like before school, he'll take her sometimes, or after school, just kind of depends on both of our schedules.
Would you agree with me that Mr. Norn is quite close to his daughter, even though the two of you are now separated?
Yeah, they try to be, for sure.
They love each other.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Was it obvious to you that Mr. Norn was excited to see his daughter, having not seen her for a couple of weeks?
Yeah, it was obvious for both of them. It was a sporadic, from the heart. They didn't do it under any type of, it just was without thought. that interaction. They just did what they felt was right in that moment.
It was very quick. The moment was quick.
Yeah.
A quick peck on the cheek and
Yeah.
backed away.
Yes, exactly.
Now, I'm not casting any blame. Did you have a lock on your windows?
Yeah, sure do.
Could have engaged it.
100%.
Hindsight is 100%, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. If any of us knew any of this situation was going to happen, we wouldn't. We would make different choices. All of us, I'm sure.
When you picked up your daughter from the airport, you didn't realize that you, and by the fact that you picked her up, she were supposed to be isolated. You didn't realize that?
No, we knew. We knew we were supposed to be isolating. 100%, no doubt.
From the moment you picked up your daughter from the airport.
Yep, I read the rules. I knew what I was in for.
Okay, so you knew that you were breaching the rules by not going directly home.
Yes.
Okay. So help us understand your own isolation here for a moment. What day did your isolation start?
On April 8th.
You got a letter from Protect S.N.W.T, did you?
In Yellowknife at the time, when you traveled outside of Yellowknife, you had to admit a plan, an isolation plan advising when you were coming back. And so I had done that for my daughter. And when picking her up at the airport, then at the minute she arrived, we began our isolation for 2 weeks.
Okay. Your isolation started on April 8th. When did you understand your isolation was finished?
I'm really not good with dates, so 2 weeks after April 8th.
Okay. If you want to make reference to a calendar on your computer, I have no difficulty with that.
Okay, I'm gonna look it up on my phone calendar.
So do the math for us as you understand your isolation starting on April 8th. When did you understand you were free to leave the house?
April 8th. So it would have been the 22nd.
You'd be free to leave your house.
I believe so.
It's not a test. It's a test of your memory, but not a test of your math. Okay?
Yeah, I mean, they call you like every day and try to make sure you're in isolation. There was a lot of contact with public health at the time, so
Did you find the information
was in isolation till they told me I wasn't in isolation, basically.
Did you find that the communication with the authorities about your isolation was clear?
No, it's a very frustrating system. There's a lot of misinformation or miscommunication, and each public health nurse that calls you, you get a different one every day, and they give you different information. Even like the contact tracing, like they didn't ask me really any questions when we got back with COVID, but my boyfriend, who also tested positive, had to answer like a million questions. So it just depended, like as humans, we're all different, right? So it depended who you were in contact with that day with public health, what information you were given.
So from your communications with your boyfriend, did it strike you that the information that you were getting and the way your cases were being handled was inconsistent?
Inconsistent, and what was frustrating me was the fact that they didn't report my daughter's flight. They basically thought children couldn't pass COVID on in that moment until the NJ breakout. And so they didn't take the fact that she had traveled being an issue or of concern. And they didn't even really ask me any contact tracing questions. But then I had known that Steve got asked a million questions. I knew that Trisha got asked a million questions. I knew that Scott had got asked all these questions. And I just thought it was odd that they were like kind of leaving me and my daughter out of all this. It was weird.
Is Scott your boyfriend?
Not anymore. At the time, he was.
Did you speak with anybody else in April or May about what they understood about the isolation requirements?
Yeah, it was. I absolutely have had multiple conversations with people within our office, and they're lawyers, and they were part of the the breakout during that period of time, and they said that they were frustrated because everyone was given different information, and they also, public health wasn't giving a release date. They weren't telling people like when they'd be done isolation. So ours went from the 8th for 4 weeks, 4.5 weeks. So it was a long period of time to be in isolation without kind of having something to look forward to, a date of being done. So a lot of people in Yellowknife have been provided misinformation from different people.
My understanding is you work at the Department of Justice.
Yeah, well, federal government, yeah.
Right, Federal Department of Justice, which handles all the prosecutions in the north.
Yeah.
It's not like in the south, we have two different levels of prosecution.
Totally, yeah. No, yeah, we are a federal bodied institution that goes after criminals, so criminal law.
Alleged criminals.
Alleged criminal law, absolutely.
You're surrounded by justice lawyers, and when you say you spoke with the people you work with, some of whom are lawyers, that's to whom you're referring.
Absolutely, and even they were frustrated because a lot of them had children that became part of that outbreak, and you know, I was complaining a lot about being in isolation for such a long period of time that they were sharing their stories about what they experienced during that isolation period as well.
And just so that we're clear, what outbreak are you referring to, and when did that occur?
So we were the beginning cluster, from what I understood, was myself and my daughter, and that as it progressed ended up somehow hitting the school NJ, which would have been 2 weeks after we had kind of had it. So it was all of April.
And the school to which you're referring in Yellowknife is what?
Is NJ, so NJ McPherson School, and it was shut down because students had it in the classroom.
Okay, now sorry, go ahead.
And to add one more thing, also, my neighbors caught it 2 weeks after us as well from the NJ outbreak because they had children at that school.
But the common element there, from what you understood, was the school, not that they were your neighbors.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that our next door neighbors also contracted it because there is no real, I haven't been, it's a lot of speculation, right? Like public health hasn't came out and said, okay, you were in patient 1 and that's patient 30, you know what I mean? So for me, it was kind of interesting that 2 neighbors ended up with it at the same time.
You also mentioned isolation of 4.5 weeks. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so because we went into isolation on April 8th, we were then in isolation till the 22nd. On that date, they said we were allowed to get out, but that date we would have done our COVID test. And within a 24-hour period, we would have had our COVID test. And then once we had our COVID test, we were back in isolation for another 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks.
Okay. Do you remember getting an email from Protect N.W.T. on what you understood to be the last day of your isolation, asking about symptoms?
Well, it's like a mandatory, you get it every 3 or 4 days that you're in isolation. You get like a little symptom check form, yeah.
That is it.
Yes.
Okay, but what was the final communication, or at least what you understood to be the final communication to allow you to consider your isolation over? Do you remember what that was?
There, I didn't get anything. That was why I was actually in distress. I was in distress. I was panicking. It was quite traumatic.
Do you remember what the last communication was that you had at the end of your first isolation? Was it a phone call, an email?
I mean, I think that they were calling me every day. So I would have imagined I would have just had a phone conversation with them saying like, okay, your COVID is complete. Then on that same day, we would have went out and got our test, our COVID test. And then those people were like, you're fine. You don't need to isolate. But within 24 hours, because we got the positive test, then we had to immediately resume isolation again.
Okay, so you finished one, and very shortly thereafter, you had to start another isolation.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you remember what time of the day you understood your isolation was over?
Oh, no, I have no idea. They didn't tell me the time.
When did you first go out on the understanding that your first isolation was over? Was it in the morning, the evening, the afternoon?
Oh yeah, it was the morning for sure. It would have been the morning, and I went and did my COVID test, and yeah, it would have been a.m.
That day?
Yeah.
You went to work that day?
No, I didn't go to work.
Was it a work day? The 22nd was a Thursday.
Yeah, it would have been a work day.
Did you go to work on Friday the 23rd, or were you back in isolation already?
Yeah, I actually worked from home for that whole period of time. So I was working from home, but not physically in the office.
Sir, if I can just have 5 minutes to speak with Mr. Alabi, and I'm sorry, we'll just ask you to stick around if the adjudicator allows the break.
Turn for 5 minutes, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you.
This court is adjourned. I'm sorry, this hearing is adjourned for a 5-minute recess.
You go ahead, Mr. Cooper, if I wasn't on the record before. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Did you get a call on April 22nd releasing you from your isolation? April 22nd?
I'm sure I did. Yeah, I'm sure that they would have called me and told me.
On April 22nd?
Yeah.
Did anybody specifically tell you April 22nd was your release date?
It would have just been what, like, I was asking them every day. What's my date that I'm done?
And somebody told you, or more than one person told you along the way, the 22nd?
Yeah.
Okay, based on the fact that you entered into isolation on April 8th.
Yes.
You also mentioned that you did a COVID test, I think on the same day, on the 22nd or the 23rd?
The emails came like every 3 days. So it would just be like automatic, and it came from like CSIS.
Okay, but do you remember whether you did the COVID test
I would
on
have done it, yeah.
April 22nd or April 23rd?
I'm not 100% sure. I would have to go and see if I could find it.
Okay, either on the day that you understood that your isolation was over and you were free, which was April 22nd, or the following day you understood you had to do a COVID test.
The following day, well, yeah, I knew that I had to do the COVID test, not because that was part of the rules, but because there was the wastewater email that we got from them. And it didn't say you had to. It was suggested that you should go get tested. It wasn't mandatory.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cooper.
Just a second. Yeah. Yes. So, okay. Thank you, Ms. Schwint. We have no further questions, and I thank you for your patience. I know we've kept you waiting, and I apologize, but that's the way these things go sometimes.
I understand.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. The next witness is Stephanie Gilbert. Mr. Cooper, have you got that printed in color?
We managed through the good office of your associate to get a color printed version.
Oh, excellent. What about you, Madam Anderson?
I'm just going to need to save it to a thumb drive and send it downstairs to be printed, sir.
Okay, so should we take a short break?
Sure.
How long will that take? Just can we just wait on the line?
5 minutes?
We'll take a 5-minute break.
Okay, 5 minutes.
This hearing is adjourned for a 5-minute break. This court is resumed following adjournment. I'm sorry, this hearing is resumed following an adjournment.
And thank you, is Ms. Stephanie Gilbert present? Anderson, could I have the witness sworn in or affirmed?
Would you like to swear or affirm, ma'am?
Swear.
Place your hand on the Bible there, please. And can you say your full name, please?
Stephanie Judith Gilbert.
Do you swear, Ms. Gilbert, that that the evidence you shall provide today shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I swear. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ms. Gilbert. I'd like to begin by informing you that pursuant to Section 8 of the Public Inquiries Act, you do have the right to object to answer any question under Section 5 of the Canada Evidence Act. The Public Inquiries Act also provides that any witness at an inquiry shall be deemed to have objected to answer any question asked of the witness on the ground that the answer of the witness may tend to incriminate the witness or may tend to establish the liability of the witness to a civil proceeding at the instance of the Crown or of any person. And no answer given by a witness at an inquiry shall be used or be admissible in evidence against the witness in any trial or other proceedings against the witness taking place after the inquiry, other than a prosecution for perjury in the giving of evidence. Do you understand that? Is that a yes?
Yes, can they not hear me? Do I have to press this every time?
I did hear you that time, thank you. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Could you please state your name and occupation?
Sure, I'm Stephanie Gilbert and I'm a registered nurse for the S.N.W.T.
And what is your role as far as COVID-19 exposure investigations?
Sure, so I am presently the clinical coordinator for the COVID Outbreak Incident Command. So that means that I manage a team that responds to COVID outbreak in the Yellowknife region.
And approximately how many contact tracing investigations have you been involved in since the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Probably about 600 or so.
Wow, a lot. Can you tell us what happens when a resident of the Northwest Territories tests positive for COVID-19?
Sure. So when someone tests positive for COVID-19, because it is a reportable communicable disease, we do have a mandate under the Public Health Act to report that diagnosis as well as follow up with it with case management. So for COVID-19, being that it is a deadly disease, we have a very prompt turnaround time. So we try to notify patients of their positive status as soon as we are able to. After doing that, we also notify the Chief Public Health Office so that they are aware of a positive status in a new case. We also then, within 24 hours, need to complete and report a completed case investigation. So that requires us to find out the exposure history of that case. And a case is someone who's positive for whatever disease that you are investigating. So if we are investigating a case, we need to find out their exposure history, typically 14 days worth of events and activities, anybody that would have been exposed to COVID-19 during their communicable period. We then also need to notify said contacts and give them public health advice about isolation, testing, and symptom monitoring and safety precautions. And we have to get that completed within 24 hours with a written report to the Chief Public Health Office, as well as amongst your outbreak team for appropriate follow-up.
And so what would be the first step of a case investigation?
Sure, so I would call the case. I would call and notify them that they were positive for COVID-19. I would do a symptom check with that person because it's really important to have an idea of the severity of their disease presentation. So someone might be asymptomatic, they might have mild symptoms, or they might have red flag symptoms, which then prompts the case investigator to provide appropriate interventions. So whether that's seeing a physician, having a virtual assessment, or going to the emergency department, for example, based on that symptom assessment. We also do some teaching with the case about what symptoms they should be looking out for at home and which of those symptoms are considered severe or dangerous. We then proceed to give them a little bit of advice about isolation requirements for themselves, their household. We also then provide testing advice for their household members if applicable. And then generally we give them a little bit of time to process that information. Sometimes it's a shock and they need a bit of mental health support in that time. So sometimes what we'll do is say, okay, think about it a little bit. I'm going to call you back and I'm going to do a full investigation about your activities, anywhere you've been. And we ask them to reference things like their social media, their text messages, their banking statements, anything that might trigger for them their activities over the 14-day period. And then we call them back, gather that information, ask clarifying and prompting questions, and then compile that into a document so that we can do a risk assessment for each of those potential exposures throughout that 14-day period.
In your experience, how long does a contact tracing investigation usually take?
Oh, I just heard a weird sound there. Okay. Usually it takes a total time of talking on the phone with someone for approximately 45 to 60 minutes. That might be broken up into 2 calls if they need a little bit of a break or if they need to find somewhere safe to isolate. But the total investigation time, typically 45 to 60 minutes, maybe a bit longer if there are multiple cases within one household and we are interviewing the whole household.
And are there situations where an investigation might take a little bit longer than that?
Absolutely. So if they have a complicated exposure history, or if they're someone who has a lot of activities during their investigation time. So what's important for us is to note that during that 14-day period, there's a communicable period of 72 hours where that case could infect others. So we spend a lot of extra time focusing on that 72-hour window. And the reason for that is so we can identify if there is any public risk, and we try to maximize safety by narrowing down exposures during that communicable period and then focusing on contacting those persons. Outside of the communicable period, we do look at activities for up to 14 days prior, and that helps us determine where the case might have themselves been infected. So it does help us find the whole picture. How could they have gotten COVID and how could they have transmitted it onwards? So there are times where that can be a lengthy process depending on how busy that person was during their investigation period. It also might be more difficult if they can't recall details, or if their story changes, or if they feel that they need a little bit more time to put the events together, because not everyone's memory is going to be perfect in that moment, especially if they are emotionally distressed or worried about their new diagnoses.
I see. Right now, if I could get Ms. Anderson, if you could provide Ms. Gilbert with a copy of tab 27, which is her witness statement and the attachments. And do you have that in front of you, Ms. Gilbert?
I do.
If I could refer you to what's called Appendix A of your witness summary, and if you look in the top right-hand corner, there are numbers. They're a little small, but there should be numbers in the corner there. And I'm looking at page 1. So let me know when you found it. It says Appendix A and then page 1.
Yeah, it's right
Visit
here.
record You've got it. Okay, great. And so this looks like a visit record. And could you tell us a little bit about this document?
So this was inputted into electronic medical record by Excel Kierman, who is an RN, and it looks like it must have been put in at the time of Steve Norn's COVID swab.
And what is a visit record?
So a visit record is at any point where we've had an interaction with a patient. We try to track those by creating an encounter in the electronic medical record. So a visit record would be a time where we've had a phone call or an appointment with a patient.
Would you agree that from page 1 and then going ahead to page 20, those would be the visit records for Steve Norn as part of your contact investigation?
Yes, these are the ones I printed when I was asked to.
All right, if I could have that, so that's called Appendix A. If I could have that entered as our next exhibit, that would be exhibit number, and marked as exhibit number 27.
It'll be so marked, exhibit 27.
Just pages 1 to
And
20.
this is just page 1 to 20.
That's right, yeah. 27. And so if we could go now to page 2 of the visit records. And so this is for April 21st, 2021 at 2:10 p.m. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And this visit record, would you agree, was created by Rylund Johnson?
Rylund Johnson. Yes.
Oh, thank you, yes. And looking at the form, it appears that it was Ms. Nakenko who informed Mr. Norton that he had tested positive COVID-19. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, at the top of the form, it says identified by 2 identifiers. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So every time we call someone by phone, because we're not there in person to look at their healthcare card or ID, what we'll do, for example, is call someone and say, can you confirm for me your full name and your date of birth, or some other form of identifier if they know their healthcare number or something like that. Something that we can compare to the medical chart to ensure that we're talking to the correct person.
Thank you. And looking under the heading on that same page, subjective, it says consent obtained for phone consult, client made aware of positive COVID-19 test from April 20th, 2021, test day. Arrived to Yellowknife April 4th from Grand Prairie to Yellowknife via personal vehicle with girlfriend. Reports isolating since return. Isolation finished on the 18th of April, 2021. Reports having sniffles only. Denies all other symptoms of COVID, including fever. Has reported that he has had number 1 of the Moderna, 25th of March, 21. And then it says denies contact with all other people within the isolation time frame. He only remained at home when asked number of times if there were any instances he may have gone outside for walks, etc. Denies anyone else living in the home besides his girlfriend. Encourage client to try to remember if there were any visitors or if anyone stopped by or met on a walk or denies any encounters. Is that an accurate reading?
Yes.
And how did you become involved in the contact tracing investigation for Mr. Norn?
So when we are doing territorial response for COVID, that does require some on-call hours. We all took a week at a time. I was on call for after hours that week. Plus, I was also team lead of COVID response. So the combination meant that I was taking over the investigation after normal work hours. So it would have been 4 p.m. that day that R.L. would have been done work, and I would have taken over from there, just so that we could meet that 24-hour turnaround.
Right. Now, if I could refer you to page 4 of that same exhibit. So this is the visit record for April 21st at 5 p.m. See that?
Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Sparrow. This is Jenna Mearns, the court reporter talking. I'm having a little trouble hearing you when you're looking at the documents. I think maybe I can't really see, but maybe the microphone is
Maybe a little too close. I'll try moving it away.
okay. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but thank you.
So looking at that document, it appears that, was this your first telephone consultation with Mr. Norn?
Yes.
And you had several subsequent telephone consultations with Mr. Norn, is that correct?
That's correct.
And if we could turn now to page 7 of that same exhibit. And so this is for April 22nd, 2021 at 2:51 p.m. Have you got that?
Yes.
Now, the first entry states, call to client on conference call with a epidemiologist, duly, for exposure investigation, correct?
Correct.
And who does duly refer to?
So Julie Miller is an epidemiologist that worked with the Chief Public Health Office and also worked with us at NTHSSA for our COVID response.
And why did Julie Miller participate in that conference call?
At that point, the need to pull an epidemiologist into investigations occurs not routinely, but when we feel that we need to really dig deeply into an investigation, and when we really need to focus in on sort of like small details about timing, mask use, air quality in the room during exposures. Because an epidemiologist has, advanced knowledge of disease behavior, as well as input in and insight into how to contact trace, they're often very useful when you have a difficult investigation to help narrow in and really focus investigations to get just accurate detail.
And so why did Julie Miller become involved in this particular case?
At that point, our staff that were doing COVID response at Yellowknife Public Health, in consultation with the Chief Public Health Office, did feel that we were missing details of Mr. Noren's exposure timeline, and we weren't getting a true sense of the risk involved, and then we therefore could not make good decisions to the public about who was exposed or not. And that occurred not because of what Mr. Norton shared, but because of the numerous phone calls that we got from the public self-identifying as potential risks. And they self-identified that they had gotten text messages or phone calls or saw the news. So text messages or phone calls from Mr. Norn and or the news releases that he participated in, identifying himself as someone who had COVID. So people were calling in, and once that information came across our desk, we have a duty to investigate those things for public safety. So to clarify sort of what the risk truly was, the re-interview with Mr. Noren and with our epidemiologist and one of our RNs, Chanel Kelly, occurred on this day to try and put the whole of the story together as much as they could.
And according to the visit record, it states call started at 12, client needed a break at 12:30, call resumed at 13:30, correct?
Yes.
And at the bottom of the visit record, it states date and time created April 22nd, 2021, 2:51 p.m., correct?
Correct.
So does this mean the conference call lasted until approximately 2:51 p.m.?
Or very close to. Chanel would have created the encounter when she was ready to document about it, which would have been after they completed pages 21 to whatever there.
So it was quite a lengthy conference call then.
It was.
If we could move now to what has been called Appendix B of your witness statement. And so this document is entitled COVID-19 Exposure Investigation Form, and it can be found at page 21 of that bundle of documents. Do you have it there?
Yes.
Is this the COVID-19 exposure investigation form completed for Steve Norn?
It is.
If I could have this document entered and marked as the next exhibit, which I believe is Exhibit 28.
That'll be marked as Exhibit 28. That's the COVID-19 exposure investigation form.
And this, just to clarify, this document runs from pages 21 to 24. Who compiled this form that we're looking at?
So typically when we create an exposure investigation form, you'll see at the top an investigator's name. And usually there is one investigation form completed with one date and one investigator. But if you look at the several days, or several pages, sorry, you'll see that there have been multiple additions to that timeline and that investigation form from multiple persons as information came to us.
I noticed that the text in the investigation form appears to be color-coded, or there's different colors there. Can you explain the use of the different colors?
Sure. It's not typical for us to have to do multiple color coding, but because this investigation form ended up in multiple drafts and having multiple changes over a period of time, we had to find a way to identify who wrote what information into this form, as well as a color code to identify new or important information. So in black, under activity details, you'll see some very quick and basic information put in there in black font. Those were entered by R.L. At the time of her initial discussion with Mr. Noren. And then you'll see in black writing as well where it says addendum. Those were notes that I would have added later when I re-interviewed Mr. Noren. There's also an important addendum here in blue that you'll see under day -3, April 17th. That writing in blue was not disclosed to me by Mr. Norn, but was reported to me by another person, and the information is clarified there as to the source. And the green writing that is throughout activity details and notes would have been provided by the epidemiologist Julie when she did that interview with Mr. Norton and Chanel Kelly.
Thank you for explaining that for us. And so if we could move on now, I want to just look at kind of some specific dates in the investigation form. Now it appears that the investigation form contains a number of charts corresponding to different days. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And can you explain how the information in these charts has been organized? I noticed that there's 3 columns. and then various rows. Can you just explain that organization?
Sure. So if you look at page 22, you'll see there's a communicable period. That's that window of time I mentioned earlier where a case could be infectious to someone else. And that's why that table exists separately from the incubation period. That incubation period table references when someone might have been incubating COVID or could be exposed to COVID. So that's why the separation of the two periods. But in those in those two tables, the day and date refers specifically to that 14-day history, and then a countdown towards either the date of testing or the date of symptom onset. And so that's how we determine our day zero and how we determine what dates we go back to for investigations. And that's explained sort of at this chart here at the top of page 21, where it tells you your incubation period and your when your symptoms end, this sort of timeline. It helps explain why we need to know those specific dates. Under activity, that column references activities that that person participated in on that day. And then in our notes section, we might highlight particularly important information or some clarifying information. And we use those three columns to just sort of keep track of what dates certain information applies to.
Thank you very much. I do have a few questions about the information related to Mr. Norn's activities on April 8th, 2021. If we could start by looking at the entry in the row marked day 12, April 8th, on the investigation form. This is at page 21. And so do you see that here?
I have that here.
Okay, thank you. So under activity details, it states, drove from home to Sandpits alone. No one else was there. Not sure of time. Hit gold, I assume that's golf, balls into the snow, then drove home. DoorDash 10 a.m., no contact, correct?
Correct.
Now, you stated a moment ago that the text in black was entered on April 21st, or during that first contact with Mr. Norn. And so would you agree that the text for this entry is in black text, correct?
Yes.
So does that mean that this entry is likely based on the information that Mr. Norn provided on April 21st, 2021?
Yes. And I would compare that then always to the EMR entries as well, just to cross-reference in case there was an error in color coding. Because there is no perfect way to color code these, because we don't typically do that, so we don't have a set system. But that's the best of my understanding for our color coding for this particular investigation form.
Okay. And so then in the text on the same row, under the heading notes marked in green, it states, for using DoorDash service, he stated he wrote a note on his order that he is isolating so interaction would be contactless. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. And so as that text is green, was this information obtained during the conference call with Julie Miller on April 22nd?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Now, if we could go back for a moment to the visit record. So we're going back to page 8 now. And so this is the visit record for April 23rd, 2021 at 2:45 p.m. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the visit record states that Mr. Norn saw his daughter on April 8th and April 17th, both times during his isolation. So I'm just going to to read that. I know some of it is redacted. Patient brought up his biological daughter. He also disclosed, I saw her again, I just remembered, disclosed that he went to drop off a bag to her on 17th of April and hugged her. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what, to your recollection, did Mr. Norn tell you about the visit with his daughter on April 8th?
On April 8th, that initially, he told me that he had initially saw his daughter Cena through a glass window, like in a vehicle, and that there was contactless. And that would have been the April 8th encounter, I believe.
And did you subsequently learn more information about that visit?
We did. When I re-interviewed, and I can't recall exactly what date it would be in here, but he did disclose that he might have hugged her and might have kissed her. Cena.
And did Mr. Norn disclose that information? Do you remember what led up to him disclosing that information?
We persisted with our questioning on that and just asked.
And was there any, I see.
And just asked to clarify if there was any contact during that visit.
I see. And if we could, I just want to talk a little bit about Mr. Norn's activities for April 15th. And so if we could go to page 22, and this is on the COVID-19 investigation form. And so if you can look at the row marked day 5, April 15th, it states drive around, no contact with others, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And now I have a few questions about the investigation findings concerning April 17th. So now we are on the same page, page 22. If we could look at the row marked April 17th. In green text on the third column, it states, did not leave house all day, correct?
Correct.
Is this what Mr. Norn initially told you about his activities on April 17th?
It looks like he said home originally on the date of the original interview. And then you can see I added an addendum on the 23rd of April, 2021, stating that he met with his daughter and his ex, dropped off a bag to them and hugged his child. And then with the re-interview with the epidemiologist, what he stated is in green there.
So the text marked in green where it says, did not leave house all day, girlfriend cooked dinner, that information would have been received during that conference call of April 22nd?
I just want to double check the date. That would have been April 22nd with the epidemiologist and Chanel.
Okay. And so during the course of the contact investigation, did you subsequently receive other information about Mr. Norn's activities on April 17th?
I did. We got a phone call to the front main line of Yellowknife Public Health, and our admin staff, when they received that call, they brought it to me right away because of the voiced urgency of Glenn Rutland. He had left a message and a number for me to return the call at. Glenn told me that he works at the Legislative Assembly. And when I say the index case, I'm referring to Mr. Norn, that what Glenn told us was that Mr. Norn is at the Legislative Assembly and we couldn't exactly nail down the time, but it was on the 17th of April, 2021. And when I asked sort of, okay, to Glenn, do you know if anyone else was in the building and would anybody else have been exposed at that time? And what was sort of the risk 2 people in that building at the time. He notified me of 2 persons, and you can see that below. Robert Brain, and then another person whose name is blacked out, and I honestly can't recall their name.
And so you're referring to the text in blue on page 22?
Correct.
After receiving this information, did you follow up with Mr. Norn?
I did. I asked him if he had been to the Legislative Assembly at all, and if it was just something that had slipped his mind, and he wanted to let me know about that. And then I can't remember exactly what day he told me, if that would be in the EMR entries. But when we re-interviewed Mr. Norn with the epidemiologist, I believe you can see here under day -2, April 18th, that was the day Mr. Norn states he went to the Legislative Assembly.
But in that information, it appears that Mr. Norn, because I see that it's in the table for April 18th. So at that time, did Mr. Norn claim that he went to the Legislative Assembly on April 18th?
Yes, he did.
Okay. So at any time, in the course of your investigation, did Mr. Norn ever disclose to you that he attended the Legislative Assembly on April 17th, 2021?
No.
So that's a no?
No.
Now, in the same row for April 17th, so we're still on page 22, there is an addendum for April 23rd, which states that Mr. Norn met with his daughter, his ex, Natasha Schwint, and dropped off a bag to them and hugged his child, correct?
Correct.
And so because the addendum is dated April 23rd, does this mean Mr. Norn disclosed this visit to you on April 23rd?
That's correct.
And if we could now just turn back to page 8, going back to the visit record for April 23rd. Sorry for all the jumping around. So we've looked at this before, where Mr. Norn says, I saw her again. I just remembered, disclosed that he went off and dropped a bag on April 17th and hugged her. Do you remember any other details that Mr. Norn gave you about the visit with his daughter on April 17th?
No, I don't remember any other details. I just know that he self-disclosed that information. I didn't pry for that information. I was calling him to ask about some realtor activity in his unit that he was living in at the time, and he self-disclosed that activity with his daughter.
Thank you. Well, I do also have a few questions about April 18th, 2021. So if we could now turn to page 23 of the investigation report. And at the very top line of the entry for the row marked April 18th, the entry says home in black text, correct?
Correct.
And so does this mean that Mr. Norn initially reported spending April 18th at home?
That's correct.
Okay. Now to flip back again to the visit record, we're going to go to page 5. This is sorry, I'll just let you catch up there. This is the visit record for April 21st, 2021 at 7:37 p.m. And it states, I went to Racket Club, took a steam for 20 minutes, and then left, went home and showered, wore a face mask, was not near anyone, and did not spend any time face-to-face with anyone. Occurred on 19th of April, around 1330 to 1400 hours, correct?
Correct.
So then During that telephone consultation, Mr. Norn stated that he attended the Racket Club on April 19th. Is that correct?
That's correct.
During the course of the investigation, did you subsequently receive information that contradicted that timeline?
That's correct. We found out from the Chief Public Health Office that we needed to clarify the date. I'm not sure exactly how they got that information, but they did ask us to look into clarifying the date for that Racket Club visit.
And so upon receiving this information, did you follow up with Mr. Norn?
I did.
And what did he tell you?
Exactly what I wrote in here as a quote, that he went to the Racket Club, took a steam, and left, and that it happened on the 19th, between 1:30 and 2.
At any time, did Mr. Norn disclose that his visit to the Racket Club was actually on April 18th?
He subsequently did when prompted by the epidemiologist. You can see that on page 23, that he writes, that he talks about going to the Racket Club between 15:45 and 16:25 on April 18th.
And that's the text marked in green?
Correct.
And so do you recall on that conference call, did you then directly ask Mr. Norn if he had attended the Racket Club on April 18th?
That conference call was between Chanel Kelly, Julie Miller, and Mr. Norn. I wasn't on that call.
Okay, I'm sorry. But that information, because it's marked in green, would have been obtained from that call?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And if I could take you now to the visit record for April 22nd, 2021. So this is on page 6.
Yes.
And so this call took place at 9:51 a.m. The visit record states that Mr. Norn disclosed he delivered a parcel to a social worker, in quotation marks, I think on Monday, the 19th, correct?
Correct.
And according to the visit record, Mr. Norn stated the delivery was contactless, is that correct?
Correct.
In the course of your investigation, did you subsequently receive information that contradicted this timeline?
I did. I received a message from the person in question. I can't remember her name exactly. Sue Ellen something. Sorry, I don't recall her full name. But she called and let us know more detail about that encounter.
Would this have been Sue Ellen Dillabo?
Correct. It would be in my notes here. Sue Ellen R.L. is the name I have here.
Okay. And what did she tell you about her encounter with Mr. Norn?
So she let us know that she was told by Mr. Norn that he told her, Sue Ellen, that he has COVID and that she might have been exposed and that she should follow up with public health. She did call and let us know. You'll notice that I refer to her as the social worker, not because she was acting as a social worker, because that wasn't the case. It's because when we do a risk assessment of a contact, if that person subsequently turns out to be a case, that does red flag them for us in terms of the public risk exposure. So that's why I keep referring to her in my notes as the social worker, just so that I wouldn't lose track of the risk assessment for Sue Ellen's exposure. She called and let us know that the drop-off occurred on the 18th of April at 2 p.m. and she was very specific, and she said that she knew exactly when and what time that visit occurred. When I called Sue Ellen and talked with her further, she, and it's not going to be in Mr. Norn's chart because we don't write about other people in other persons' charts. So that wouldn't be in the EMR visit records. But when I spoke with Sue Ellen, she was very clear about the fact that it was maybe not totally contactless, that they did talk to each other outside on her deck, that for the most of the time they were an appropriate distance apart, but there was a time where they stood closely to exchange the package and to talk. And so she was really concerned that she might be at risk herself and then be a risk to others. So we did interview her for that.
Thank you. Now, if we could turn to the investigation form at page 22, and I'm looking at the row marked April 18th, where it states in green text, received email at 2 stating that if he is asymptomatic, that he can end isolation, states he replied that he was asymptomatic, and then at 2:04 received an email that his isolation had ended, correct?
Correct.
And if we could move to Appendix C of your witness statement, this is actually at page 26 of those documents. Can you describe what we're looking at here? I'm sorry, it's page 25.
Yeah, page 25. This is a screenshot that Mr. Noren sent to our on-call phone, our public health on-call phone, showing his email, what time he received it at. And that was requested by the Chief Public Health Office that I try to ascertain exactly when Mr. Norton would have gotten this email from Protect N.W.T. Mostly because the date and time was relevant to know at what day he was asked to isolate until.
Thank you. I would like to have this page 25, this screenshot, entered and as our next exhibit and marked as Exhibit 29.
It'll be marked at Exhibit 29, so stipulated.
And so the text of the screenshot indicates the communication is dated April 18th, 2021 at 2:04 a.m., correct?
Correct.
And the email reads, at least what we can see of it, it reads, "Hello, Stephen. According to your date of arrival, this is day 14 since entering the N.W.T. You must confirm whether or not you are experiencing any symptoms. If your date of arrival, 04/04/21, has changed, you must contact Protect N.W.T." And then it goes on to list an email address, and it appears at the beginning of a 1-800 phone number, correct?
Correct.
And so does this email actually state that Mr. Norn's isolation has ended?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
I'll repeat that. Does the email state that Mr. Norn's isolation has ended?
And what it clarifies is that April 18th is his 14th day since arriving in the Northwest Territories, and isolation is for 14 days. So this email is signaling that April 18th is his final day of isolation, meaning on the 19th, isolation would be over.
And so it's your understanding that his isolation would be over on April 19th?
Correct. I believe the way Protect NWT counts their days is whatever time Mr. Norn would have crossed the border would be the same time on the 14th day that he would be done his isolation, which is why in our initial investigation we had asked him, "You arrived April 14th at what time?" And he said 22:30, because then 22:30 on the 18th is when Protect NWT would consider the isolation to be over.
So he told you that he arrived back in Yellowknife at 2213?
2230.
Oh, 2230. Thank you. So then it's your understanding that his self-isolation would include April 18th up to 2230.
That's how Project N.W.T calculates the 14 days.
Okay, thank you. Well, I just have one more question. You mentioned that you've been involved in around at least 600 contact tracing investigations. How did your experience with Mr. Norn compare to other contact investigations you've been involved in?
Much longer, more complicated, and certainly at times stressful and difficult. I'm usually done an investigation, a case investigation, or one of my staff has done a case investigation typically within an hour. So to spend several days and multiple resources on interviewing someone stands out for us.
And is part of what made this investigation so much longer and more complicated was that Mr. Norn's timeline of events would change from one consultation to the next?
Yes.
If I could ask for just a 5-minute break to see.
We'll take a 5-minute break.
Thank you.
This hearing stands down for 5 minutes. Resumed?
Ms. Gilbert, it's Ron Barclay speaking. I'm a little confused on, we've had other witnesses testify on the isolation period. I was on perhaps the erroneous view that if I came into the Northwest Territories on April the 4th at 9 o'clock at night, the isolation period wouldn't start until the next day. And I gather from your evidence, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that if I come into the Northwest Territories at on the 4th, say at 9 o'clock at night, that the period starts at 9 o'clock at night? Have I misinterpreted what you said?
No, it's that you're hearing two different versions. So Protect N.W.T, they handle travel, and the way they calculate their dates is something that they calculate their dates differently. For us at Public Health, when we call and count for somebody their isolation period, their symptom onset, the date of their test, or the date that they arrive into the territory, we refer to that as day 0. And so you'd be correct. If you arrived at April 4th at 9 p.m., we'd call that day 0, where the 5th would become day 1, and we would count forward to 14 from there. Protect NWT, by the way they word their emails, it basically counts that 14th, that first day as day 1 at 9 p.m. So they would isolate for 14 days until 9 p.m.
Second version at 9 o'clock at night then.
Correct.
Thank you very much. I'll leave it up to Mr. Cooper. He's going to cross-examine.
Thank you. My name is Steve Cooper, and I am Mr. Norn's lawyer. Just because we're looking at the document anyways, I'm going to continue to draw your attention to exhibit number 29, which is page 25. It's the screenshot to which my friend Ms. Sparrow recently drew your attention. Do you see anything on that document that clarifies when the isolation, from Protect NWT's perspective, ends?
On this screenshot, no.
So just looking at this screenshot, you, even within the system as a professional, wouldn't be able to identify precisely when the isolation ends. Isn't that correct?
If somebody wanted that information, they would have to read the whole email.
So at least on the portion that we have on page 25, you can't draw a conclusion as to when the isolation ends, correct?
No, I suppose not, unless you actually know how to calculate the dates and the way that Protect NWT counts the dates.
Not that easy. Now, cross the border is important, given the size of the Northwest Territories. And I presume that crossing the border when you're driving would allow the person isolating under your calculations to go back the 5 or 6 hours between the moment that they cross the border and the time that the isolation ends. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So if you've recorded Mr. Norn, self-reported or otherwise, as showing up on April 4 at 22:30, realistically, we could go back generously 6 hours, and the isolation by your calculations would then end 16:30 rather than 22:30, correct?
No, because Public Health calls the travel day day 0. So the time of entering wouldn't matter to us in terms of isolation calculation, but it would be something Protect N.W.T would consider. But we are not Protect N.W.T, so we don't follow the same counting.
Okay, I might have had the calculations mixed up. It's confusing. So your understanding of Protect NWT's calculations would be that the 6 hours before the arrival in Yellowknife would count towards time in isolation, correct?
Mr. Adjudicator, I'd just like to point out that the witness is able to speak about public health practices, and I know this will likely go to wait and you'll allow the question, but I just want to point out that she doesn't have on-hands experience with Protect NWT processes and calculations.
I'm going to let Mr. Cooper go ahead.
So again, your understanding of the Protect NWT calculations is that it would be the arrival at the NWT border time, not the arrival in Yellowknife, that would start the isolation period, correct?
I can't say that for sure, which is why I noted his time of arrival in Yellowknife, because we don't calculate it the same way that Protect N.W.T does, so I can't accurately say what time they would consider.
But you have already in your evidence done precisely that. And so I'm trying to clarify the evidence you've already given, which is that the isolation is related to the time of entry to the Northwest Territories. That's your understanding, correct?
But I understood that to be when he arrived home because he was still traveling. So 22:30 is the time I put there.
And I'm not challenging you on that, but what I'm trying to clarify is you use the phrase multiple times, cross the border. So when you say cross the border, you're referring to the, in this case, Alberta NWT border, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the time that Mr. Norn crossed the NWT Alberta border, from your understanding of the calculations used by Protect NWT, that would be the start of the isolation period. And then 14 days hence, at that time, you understood he'd be out of isolation, correct?
Yes. Again, I'm not an expert in the way they calculate time, but that would be my best guess for how they would calculate it. I don't work there, so I don't know exactly, but
Whether or not somebody is in isolation, though, is important to the job that you do, correct?
correct.
So it's important for you to carry out your job to understand whether under the Protect NWT rules, somebody like Mr. Norn is in or out of isolation, correct?
Not necessarily, so you're assuming that we manage their isolation when they've traveled. We do not. Public health and COVID response, we do not manage the isolation of travelers. That is done by Protect NWT. We manage the isolation and the calculation of time required for that isolation once you are a case or a contact of a known COVID-19 infection.
And that's important because this leads me into my next area to question you upon, which is you had no involvement with Mr. Norn until April 19 or April 20, 2021, correct?
Let me check the date of our first phone call. April 20th, 2021.
And that's your visit record that was produced by an RN, tiny print, old man eyes. I think it says Keenan.
Sorry, actually, I'm going to correct myself. It was the 21st of April, 2021.
Okay, so the April 20th visit record, was that just recording the PCR that was taken, the test?
Correct.
But the first contact with anybody in your department was on April 20th, 2021 at roughly 12:15 p.m.
No, that's not my department. The swabbing center is a different group.
Okay, so this particular RN, shown on page 1 of Appendix A, happens to be Exhibit 27. That's not somebody with whom you work, correct?
Not directly.
Department. Another department?
Oh, they do results reporting.
So your department's first contact with Mr. Norn was on April 21st,
Correct.
and that's the contact that's recorded on page 2 of this exhibit.
Correct.
That was one of your colleagues that reported and created that record.
Correct.
You had nothing to do with Mr. Norn's self-isolation plan, correct?
After his travel, no. Once he became a case, yes.
Your concerns expressed in your examination by Ms. Sparrow all post-date Mr. Norn's isolation, correct?
Sorry, I don't understand your question. All of my cases are posted.
Sorry. Your concerns about Mr. Norn, the complexity that required the involvement of the epidemiologist, arose after he had completed his isolation plan, having re-entered the Northwest Territories after his trip to Alberta, correct?
So those, our dealings with him occurred after his travel isolation, yes. Is that what you're asking?
Maybe in a convoluted way, but yes, okay? You've explained that you had difficulties contract tracing with him. That happened after his isolation was over, correct?
After his travel isolation was over.
And that's a good distinction. So you agree with that statement?
Yes.
Did you speak with the nurse that created the visit record shown as page 2 of Exhibit 27? This particular record?
Yes.
Did she read and confirm the contents of this record for you?
Sorry, you want me to confirm if she read this to me?
I'm asking you,
Okay.
this is part of your evidence, whether you asked this registered nurse if she reviewed this record and confirmed its accuracy to you.
Yes.
So you went to the nurse and said, can you read this and confirm for me that it's true?
I did not word it like that.
What wording did you use?
So we were in a meeting together looking at this package, and she confirmed that that was her entry.
In reference to the next record, page 3, did she do the same thing?
Yes?
Was Nurse Chanel Kelly at the same meeting?
No.
Did you have an opportunity to speak with Nurse Kelly to determine whether what she wrote on page 7 of Exhibit 27 was accurate?
I did not ask her that.
Am I correct in understanding that she produced the record which is page 7 of Exhibit 27?
That she wrote this entry in his EMR? Yes.
Understand that just because the record reports that information, correct?
Correct.
Now moving to page 10 of Exhibit 27, there's a nurse, and again, very small print. I think it says Allerhead. Do you see that on page 10?
I do.
Okay. Was Nurse Allerhead, if that's her name, was she at the meeting to which you previously referred?
No.
An opportunity to ask Nurse Allerhead whether the report that is at page 10 of Exhibit 27 was accurate?
I did not.
I take it that similarly with page 11, you didn't get a chance to ask Nurse Kelly about the accuracy of the report?
I did not.
Second. Turning to page 13, another nurse is identified. I think it's Nurse Miklosevic. Was that nurse at your meeting?
No.
Did you have an opportunity to ask this nurse if the contents of the report at page 13 of Exhibit 27 was accurate?
No.
Similarly, on page 16, there's another nurse. I think it's Nurse Curley. Was she at that meeting?
No.
Did you have an opportunity to ask her if the contents of the report were accurate?
No.
Moving to page 17, the document appears to be prepared by a Nurse Argue. Did you have an opportunity to ask her whether the contents of that report were accurate?
No.
Similarly, page 18, Nurse Campbell. Did you have an opportunity to ask Ms. Campbell whether the contents of that report were accurate?
No.
Was Ms. Campbell or Nurse Argue at the meeting to which you previously referred?
No.
Moving now to the colored exhibit, which is exhibit number 28. That starts at page 21. If you can bring your attention to page 21, which is exhibit 28. I understand that the green text in some fashion relates to communications with the epidemiologist. I think her name was Julie. Is that correct?
Correct.
So help me understand these notes. So when I see on day 14, the first note under activity, day, and notes says, lives in townhouse, has separate entrance from rest of public. What is that meant to communicate? Who's speaking?
Who is speaking?
Well, who is saying lives in townhouse, has separate entrance from rest of public? Is that the epidemiologist speaking?
Yes. Writing what Mr. Norn has told her.
Okay.
That he lives in a townhouse with a separate entrance from the rest of the public.
And did the epidemiologist actually write those notes, or have they been transcribed from something else?
She typed them in there.
She typed them right into this exposure investigation form that forms Exhibit 28?
Yes.
So all of the notes under the heading, community notes, that are in green, were entered into this form by the epidemiologist, correct?
Correct.
Did you have an opportunity to ask the epidemiologist whether these notes were accurate or not?
No.
And so my understanding is that this is the epidemiologist reporting what Mr. Norton said. Is that your understanding?
Correct.
Did you edit any of these notes?
Pardon?
Did you edit any of these notes?
The green notes? No.
Under the title Activity Details, there are various entries, some of which have been touched upon by Ms. Sparrow. When I see the word home as the first entry, is that an entry that you made?
That would be from the original interview, Rylund Johnson.
So Nurse Nakeko entered the word home in this form,
Yes.
directly into this form.
Yes.
What about the rest of the entries under activity details that are in black? Who's entered all of those details?
Unless it specifically says addendum, the black writing is from Rylund.
Okay, so the first reference to addendum that I see under activities is for day -3, April 17, and the first of the two addendums are in black. Who entered addendum 23, April 21?
That would be, if we look at the EMR entry, dated on the same time, the 23rd, with the clarifying entry in his medical chart, it correlates. That was me.
And the next addendum, which is in blue, same date, who entered that information?
I did. I am
And-
SG. Reported to SG. SG is me, Stephanie Gilbert.
Okay, I may have missed this, but is there a reason that the second of the two addendums is in blue and the first is in black?
Because I needed to highlight that this was an important bit of information when we resubmitted it to the Chief Public Health Office.
Who received the phone call from Glenn Rutland indicating the information that you've recorded in that blue-colored addendum?
I spoke with Glenn Rutland.
Was that in response to a message that he left at your office?
I want to say he left me a message, or did somebody walk into my office and say he's on the other line? It's one of the two, but the staff notified me as soon as possible when they realized that Glenn was calling with important information.
And how did Mr. Rutland identify himself when he spoke to you?
Pardon?
How did Mr. Rutland identify himself when he spoke to you?
He gave me his name and explained where he worked and what his concern was.
Did he identify himself by title?
I can't remember right now. He must have, but I didn't write it down, so I can't say for sure.
Were you previously familiar with Mr. Rutland, such that maybe you would have known what his title was at the time?
No.
Are these your original notes, or are they compiled or derived from another set of notes that you originally recorded?
I usually write things down on paper while I'm on the phone and or type directly into the exposure while I'm doing an investigation.
So these might be the original notes, or they might be a compilation of notes from another source, correct?
They would belong to me. that addendum, the 23rd of April 2021, those notes belong to me, and I wrote them in there. So they're not compiled from other person's notes. This is information I received firsthand.
Now, what I'm suggesting, I'm asking you whether you wrote the notes on a piece of paper and then transcribed them onto this form.
Right now, I have no idea. April 17th was a long time ago. I can't answer you either way. I don't.
You wrote this on April 23rd.
Okay, still, the April 23rd, I don't recall.
So that we're clear. Moving down under communicable period, the very first entry, day -2, April 18, are these your notes or is this the other nurse's notes, the Keiko?
Again, the word home in black is from R.L, not Keiko.
Okay. And what about the paragraph immediately succeeding that starts received email at 0200 hours? Whose note is that, yours or the other nurse?
That belongs again to Julie Miller, who's the epidemiologist. She writes in green.
Okay. I guess at this point I have to admit a certain color blindness. I thought it was black. So now that I know it's green, I understand that the epidemiologist wrote this note. Any idea why she didn't follow the previous practice of writing it under the word notes?
No?
Did you participate on that call where that note was made?
No.
Did anybody other than the epidemiologist participate in the call with Mr. Norn on about this note?
You'll see in the EMR visit record that Chanel Kelly, a registered nurse, was in that call as well.
And during that call, it appears, from reading the notes, that Mr. Norn explained that as of 2:04, when presumably he received the email from Protect N.W.T, he understood that his isolation was over. Do you agree that that appears to be what's being communicated there?
That's what he self-reports.
And do you know if Chanel discussed with Mr. Norn the fact that maybe his isolation wasn't over despite his self-reporting?
I don't know that answer.
Now, I appreciate that you've described your interactions with Mr. Norn, and contact tracing is a bit complicated. And I'm curious whether part of that complication derives out of the fact that a day or two after travel isolation is complete, he tests positive for COVID. So it was a complicating factor. He wasn't just residing in the Northwest Territories, discovers he has COVID, and therefore you're trying to trace. Is any of that a factor in the complications that you described in dealing with Mr. Norn's contact tracing?
No.
Your contact tracing presumably had to extend to other jurisdictions?
Not by our team. The Chief Public Health Office, they deal with other jurisdictions. We don't do that, so that did not have any impact on the complexity of my work or my team's work.
You presumably, or one of your staff, would have contacted the Chief Public Health Officer's office for that purpose?
Yes.
And were there ongoing communications with the Chief Public Health Office with respect to contact tracing in other jurisdictions?
Not in other jurisdictions. That's not the job that we do on our team.
Was there any interaction between your office and the Chief Public Health Office with respect to their findings from other jurisdictions, because it might affect your local contact tracing in the Northwest Territories?
We did not discuss any findings from other jurisdictions.
Sir, if I might just have 5 minutes to ask Mr. Hallaby what, if anything, I've missed, I would appreciate that.
We'll take a 5-minute break.
This hearing is adjourned for 5-minute break.
Thank you.
And just to
Go
confirm,
ahead, Mr.
I was asked by the adjudicator if I had any further questions. And in fact, I do in one specific area. When I look at your witness summary, and I appreciate that's not your evidence, you describe the investigation as being very complicated due to Mr. Noren's changing story. Is that an accurate reflection about how you feel about your involvement with Mr. Norn?
Yes.
What exactly made it complicated? What did he change in his story that complicated your job?
What was complicated about it was the fact that we had to revisit multiple times with multiple multiple times where we've had to call and clarify parts of his investigation and actually land on an accurate timeline. It's not.
What way did Norton contribute to that? Is really what I'm getting at. I appreciate that you had to go through a bunch of steps, and contact tracing can be difficult. But what are you saying that Mr. Norn did to increase the complicated nature of your important task?
I would say that Mr. Noren didn't share information unless specifically asked about that information at times, and then he would give an answer. So that's what makes it difficult, is that we have to rely on whoever we're talking to participate in the interview itself.
Okay, well, be more specific than that. What exactly did Mr. Norn not volunteer? What facts?
So specifically, the Racket Club visit, the time and date of that was confirmed by the Chief Public Health Office by video footage. And when I was tasked by them to clarify and ask Mr. Noren what day and time he was there, they didn't match. So that makes it very complicated in terms of which version, Mr. Noren's or the video evidence, does one present to the community for a public health advisory or a public health exposure. That's an example of why that was difficult.
Okay, so let's talk about that one. He told you the 19th, but you discovered it was the 18th. Is that correct?
Let's look. So let's double check that. I don't want to trust my memory. That was a really long time ago for specific dates. So he told us the April 19th between 1:30 and 2 p.m. And then the Chief Public Health Office discovered that it was actually April 18th on April 18th. And then when we revisited that, it was the 18th, 2021. So the wrong dates.
So he was wrong by 1 day, correct?
Correct.
And you concluded that based on the information or evidence of the Chief Public Office, is that right?
Correct.
And they in turn purportedly got information from the Racket Club?
Yeah. Yes.
Let's follow the evidence here. The Racket Club purportedly reported a time and date of Mr. Norn's attendance to somebody at the Chief Public Health Office, who then reported this information to your office. Have I traced the information correctly?
Yes, I believe so. I
And go ahead.
was going to say that I don't ask the Chief Public Health Office to prove things to me. I take direction from the Chief Public Health Office.
And was it you that received the information that had been transmitted from the Racket Club about the video information concerning Mr. Norn's attendance?
Via the Chief Public Health Office, yes.
But you received it in your office. It was you?
It was on, we do rounds with the Chief Public Health Office via Teams meetings. And so we were on a meeting with them.
And from whom did you receive the information at the Chief Public Health Office?
I can't specifically recall that. It wasn't something that I wrote down or have anything that is written down specifically about that, and I can't remember.
Did you view the video from the Racket Club purportedly showing Mr. Norn attending a day before he self-reported?
No.
Do you know if anybody at the Chief Public Health Office viewed the video?
They said they did, but that's all I can tell you about that.
So somebody at the Chief Public Health Office told you that they personally saw the video with Mr. Norn attending the Racket Club a day before he self-reported. Is that right?
That's very specific wording. I can tell you that the Chief Public Health Office notified us that they had video evidence of that date and time, and they asked me to question Mr. Norn about it.
And as a result of that apparent one-day discrepancy, what additional work was necessary by your office with respect to contact tracing?
It changes who in the public would have been in the building at the time and who would have been impacted by that public risk exposure. So when we are off by a day doesn't sound relevant most situations, but when you're talking about a deadly disease and the exposure within a building, and we don't know if it's the 18th or the 19th, that greatly impacts those individuals that are in the building. And we have a duty to assess public risk and to provide safety to the public when we know there is an exposure. So the date being the 18th or the 19th does impact the way that the people in that building that were exposed, feeling safe or unsafe and not being sure if they're exposed to COVID, that is important, even if it's only a day.
Sorry. When you initially received the information from Mr. Norn that his attendance was on the 19th, did you immediately action that information, your office?
Yes.
What action did you undertake as a result of information that Mr. Norn was at the Racket Club on April 19th?
So when we know that there is a COVID exposure in a public place or in a workplace, we have to notify that business or that building or that whoever is in charge of that space. So whether it's a boarding home or it's the Racket Club or it's another gym, we have to notify them of that exposure right away so that they can, number one, do an assessment of who was in the building at the time. Number two, look at what staff were there and what safety risks to the people that work in the building are. We also then alert the Chief Public Health Office, who helps facilitate us providing a letter or a specific action plan for that place. So in the case of the Racket Club, that required somebody notifying the racket club of the exposure with the date and time so that they could compile a list of who was using the gym at the time, who was the staff working in the facility at the time, as well as put out a public health advisory, because sometimes you can track exactly who is where in a building and sometimes you can't. So the public health advisory goes out as a supplement so that people have the opportunity to self-identify as a risk. So that's the action we take, which is why it's important to know if it's the 18th or the 19th and what time.
And had you undertaken all of those activities before you received a suggestion that the date was wrong?
Yes, because we have to promptly notify the public of risk when we know about it. So there are processes of who we have to report to, and when they act on that, like, so when we report that to the Chief Public Health Office, they can action those items when they choose to, but our team has to notify them of those things and notify the business.
And what was the time period between the self-reported date of April 19th by Mr. Norn and what you understood the corrected date was of April 18th?
Sorry, what was the question? What is the difference between the two?
No, how long was it that you thought it was the 19th before you realized it was the 18th that Mr. Norn may have attended the racket club? How much time passed?
Let's see. So he, on the 21st of April, let us know that he was there on April 19th. And then on April 22, so a difference of a day, we clarified with Mr. Noren about whether it was the 18th or 19th.
And you eventually came to the conclusion that the attendance was on the 18th, not the 19th. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you ask Mr. Norn about how he had made the error? Or in fact, if it was an error in his mind?
No, it's not my job to ask that.
What other misinformation do you say that Mr. Norn gave you that created extra work for your office?
So when we also got the phone call from the Legislative Assembly on the 23rd of April, wondering about why we hadn't contacted them to let them know that they had been had an exposure, that caused us to have to re-interview and try to put the actions of that day together again. So the fact that we hadn't been told by Mr. Norn to begin with that he was there on that day, that was difficult. And what makes it difficult is that when we're talking about COVID and the incubation period and communicable periods of that disease, a couple of days makes a difference. It means that we are losing time in terms of notifying contacts, and every contact that is out there that doesn't know they were exposed has the potential to then expose others. So if somebody isn't able to give us an accurate story and an accurate account of their activities, it puts others at risk. So that's what made it difficult, is the having to go and reevaluate days prior and then subsequently notifying contacts that they had been exposed X number of days prior, and them questioning us as to why it was taking us so long to notify them. And the public is upset when their safety is at risk for a significant amount of time without them knowing. So it was the trickle-down effect of not having an accurate story that was also difficult.
I'm curious about the reference you made to Mr. Rutland's concerns. I don't think we've heard that before. I understood that Mr. Rutland called to report that Mr. Norn had been at the legislature on April 17th, but you've added something of value, which is that he said he was concerned. It sounds like he was complaining that nobody had contacted the Legislative Assembly about that contact. Where do we find that in the notes?
I'm not sure if that's specifically in the notes. We don't make comments about people's feelings in our notes.
To use your own phrase, that's a long time ago. So are you sure that Mr. Rutland was complaining, as you indicated?
I didn't say he complained. I said he
Well,
was concerned. It sounded like it, but I said he was concerned.
Okay, let's call it a concern. Are you sure that Mr. Rutland said that he was concerned that the Legislative Assembly had not been advised?
I recall that, but it's not written down anywhere, so you're not going to be able to find that in these notes that you're looking at.
Just if we can take a moment, Mr. Adjudicator, I know that we only have until 4:30 today. This probably is going to take more than another 5 minutes. I honestly did not anticipate the length of the cross-examination after the break. I'm wondering if, as inconvenient as it may be, if that's still a limit on...
Mr. Cooper, we're going to let you continue.
Okay. Then I don't have to worry about the 5 minutes?
You need the 5 minutes, or?
Well, I need more than 5 minutes is what I'm getting at, sir.
No. You go and continue, and I'll make a call depending how long you are, but you continue.
Thank you, sir. What other information that you received from Mr. Norn are you saying complicated your task?
From Mr. Norn, that would be the stuff I've just highlighted to you. From other persons in the community, that was complicated. But that, again, is not in his electronic, it's not going to be in these notes or in his electronic medical record, because we don't write about what other people say in his chart. So that won't be in your visit records here.
Okay, but from your evidence, there were two pieces of misinformation that you received from Mr. Norn, reflecting back on his isolation period. In each instance, he was 1 day incorrect. Am I understanding your evidence on that point correctly?
In those two situations, yes.
And you knew, at least in the second instance, that there was limited and controlled contact with one individual. This was a unique circumstance, not as you described, where necessarily a whole bunch of people would have to be contacted. It's not the racket club. Would you agree with that?
At the racket club, they ended up having a significant list of contacts in the building.
Right, but I'm talking about the Legislative Assembly.
Oh, sorry, you said racket club. In the legislative,
okay.
Okay, in the Legislative Assembly, there was the one contact that is mentioned in that, on page 22.
Right, Right, and you understood, and presumably the epidemiologist understood from your understanding, that the contact reflected social distancing, minimal number of minutes interacting, little conversation, masks, and hand sanitization, correct?
Correct. That's in my EMR entry for that visit record, that Mr. Norn disclosed that assessment of his activities to me.
And you had no different information suggesting that there was more people, or the standards that I just set out weren't in fact observed.
I don't have anything from the discussion with Glenn outside of what's in this note here, which does, except for the date and time, match what Mr. Norn said.
So any complications arising from that circumstance would presumably be far less significant than that with the date and time error at the racket club, correct?
Correct, but you only know that after the fact. You don't know that until you actually lock down a date and time and find out who's in a building or not. And any person that has an exposure to COVID during someone's known isolation period is, or during their communicable period as well, they're still a risk. And it's something that we have to measure every time. So yes, in this scenario, we found out it to only be one person at the end of that.
But in fairness, you didn't know about the contact until Mr. Rutland, who is in possession of the correct information, disclosed it to you. You weren't chasing bad information. You knew that on the 17th of April, according to Mr. Rutland, that Mr. Norn attended, correct?
Let me look at the dates so on the 23rd of April, Glenn Rutland told me this. And if we look at the interview by Julie,
Page you looking at?
sorry, I'm gonna find it for you. I have to reorient myself with all these papers. There's so many. So on April 23rd, Glenn Rutland called and reported to us about the Legislative Assembly being a visit on April 17th. So, and I just want to double check at what day Mr. Noren told me that he was at the Legislative Assembly. Like, which happened first, I suppose. Let's look. So on that day of April 17th, he had originally told R.L that he was home. And then when he was interviewed by Julie on, what day did they interview each other? That would have been April 22nd. That he still said that on that day he was at home. So when we have spent that many hours re-interviewing someone about their dates and time, and then we find out the next day, you know, we feel like we have done our due diligence to clarify people's activities. So when it, after multiple attempts, doesn't match what the index case is telling us, it causes confusion, because we have to determine whether what the index case is telling us is accurate or not. So that's confusing, and it gives us, it's hard for us to know what actions to take, and have we given incorrect advice to people who were in the building or not. Like, So I know you want me to specifically tell you why that was difficult and why Mr. Noren's specific actions would have made it difficult. And it's not that he specifically did something, it's that he did not tell us.
That's important information about the important work that you do. But in reality, in this instance, because there was no suggestion he was anywhere on the 17th, your office didn't do anything until they received contrary information, correct?
Correct.
So it's different than what happened or potentially happened at the racket club, in which you were given positive information that you acted upon and then had to restart when you got new information, correct? It's different.
Okay.
Is that correct? There are different scenarios. One, you have bad information you're acting on. One, you have no information, you're not acting.
And that clarification, yes.
Okay. So in the case of the Legislative Assembly, I'm struggling with the notion that this complicated matters because you got good information from the source. So we know that they had records of Mr. Norton's attendance, video and written records. You got reliable information from Mr. Rutland on April 23rd, and you acted on that basis, correct?
But Mr. Norn didn't give us the correct date. So that's what that's the part I'm saying caused us to reevaluate the timeline and to re-explore it and re-interview.
Well, he didn't give you any date for his attendance at the legislature until you approached him with the correct information. That's my understanding. You didn't know about his attendance at the Legislative Assembly until the 23rd, and on the 23rd, you got accurate information from Mr. Rutland, and you acted on that information, correct?
No, so on the 22nd of April, in the interview with Julie Miller and Chanel Kelly, you'll see on page 23, went to the legislature to get his glasses that he forgot in his office. So at that interview, he told us that that occurred on April 18th with very specific times and very specific details about that.
And did you act on that information?
Yes. And when we attempted to figure out what was going on, that's when we got a clarifying call back, wondering why we weren't acting on the April 17th date.
But on April 23rd, in your addendum, you allege not disclosed by index case, which is presumably Mr. Norn, and yet the day before, however accurate or inaccurate, your report suggests that the test, that the index case, Mr. Norn, did report his attendance. So it can't be both.
Saying he did not disclose that he was there on the 17th of April. Until I actually call and re-interviewed Steve, I didn't know if he was there on the 17th and the 18th, or was it the 17th only? That's what I'm putting in there. Is that he didn't disclose to me that visit on that day. That's what I'm writing there.
Okay, but at 9:45 on April 22nd, you report that Mr. Norn advised you that he was at the Legislative Assembly on April 18th. So on April 22nd, you knew that he had been at the Legislative Assembly, correct?
So you're asking me if on April 22nd at 9:51 I knew about that?
9:45 is the time that I see under communicable period, day -2, 18, second full paragraph.
Day -2, April 18th. Addendum 9:45:22 of April about the two
It's
parts.
actually, the next page contains the reference.
That's in green writing, so that wasn't written by me. That was Julie Miller, and that was specifically from her interview with him on the 22nd of April.
But you had access to this information, and presumably the epidemiologist is keeping in close contact with you on this matter for which she was retained. Correct?
Yes.
So you had the information before Mr. Rutland actually contacted you, correct?
Yes, but I didn't have this date and time until the 23rd.
Was there some reason that somebody didn't follow up on this new potential contact tracing requirement on the 22nd of April?
You're assuming that nobody followed up on it? Is that what you're asking me? Is there a reason why no one followed up? That implies no one followed up.
Mr. Rutland's calling you the next day concerned that nobody had contacted the Legislative Assembly about it.
Interview and the typing up of that document happened towards the end of a business day on April 22nd. So closer to when they were completing their charting, it says 4:30 p.m. So sometimes we have to leave voicemails for people to actually return our calls. So it's very possible that in that particular evening, a phone call might have been made to leave a voicemail, but I honestly can't remember that right now because we don't track that in these documents that you're looking at in front of you about when we notify workplaces or businesses.
You're going to have to clarify the timing there. I see an addendum for which the time is early in the day, 9:45 a.m. on April 22nd. You're saying that wasn't entered into something until later in the day?
It's black writing, so addendum 0945 on the 22nd of April 21. It's in black text. That implies I wrote that. Then you go to the next page. The rest of that is written in green. So that was entered in by Julie Miller on her 22nd of April. So those are two separate timings that you're referencing.
And how do you know when the epidemiologist entered the text in green?
Because there's an EMR entry in visit records, page 7, that says Chanel Kelly on a conference call with epidemiologist Julie for exposure investigation. And it has a start time and it has a note saying that he needed a break and that they have resumed their call. And then you can see what time date and time created that entry.
Which is at 2:51 p.m. on the document, page 7, right?
Yes.
Okay. You're going to have to help me understand, though, how that gives you a timing for the entry of the green text on page 23. What's the correlation between the visit record of page 7 and the entry in green on page 23?
As I explained at the beginning when I arrived here, and also that's in my summary, that the green text was entered by Julie Miller during that interview. She types live while she's interviewing people. So Julie wrote this green text in here, and I would not, I would not have written any of this green text.
And I take it we don't know precisely at what point in the day Mr. Rutland called to express his concern on the 23rd.
I didn't write down the time, no.
Out of all of this, though, I presume that nothing had happened as a result of Mr. Norn reporting what appears to be the wrong day or any day that he entered the assembly. Is that fair to say?
No. Because
the information of the day from the epidemiologist about a possible new contact at the legislature, right?
What's your question?
The information about Mr. Norton's visit to the Legislative Assembly was first heard by the epidemiologist and a member of your staff at the end of the business day on April 22nd. That's what I understand you to have described.
So I've
Right?
described.
Okay. It appears that because it happened at the end of the day, nobody got the information to Mr. Rutland before he called to express his concern the next day, correct?
Maybe. I can't actually comment on that exactly because it's not written down here, so I can't tell you that with accuracy.
But it's fair to say that little, if any, activity occurred as a result of the late disclosure by Mr. Norn, potentially identifying the right day. You hadn't done anything with this information yet.
I don't know that though. I can't say yes or no to that question because I don't know.
And you can't say that this particular episode of misinformation, if that's what it was, added anything to complicate your contact tracing for that event.
Incorrect date does complicate contact tracing. It completely changes who is impacted by that date.
I understand, but not in this case because you hadn't done anything. The date was corrected in a matter of a few business hours, correct?
It was not corrected within a few business hours. Like we don't
On April
actually
20th?
know. We don't actually, it's not written down here as to what time, I don't remember what time Glenn Rutland called me with the date and time.
Well, it couldn't have been any more than 24 hours after the report from Mr. Norn, right? So within 24 hours.
That would be fair to say, yes.
And is there any suggestion you had done anything at all in that 24 hours in response to the disclosure by Mr. Norn that he had been at the legislature on the 19th or the 18th?
You're asking me, sorry, can you just slow down a little bit and be very clear about asking? Because it sounds like the way you're wording things is very tricky, and I feel like I can't say yes or no to your questions.
Mr. Judy, I think that the witness has answered the question. She's told Mr. Cooper that she doesn't know what contact tracing efforts took place after this disclosure about April 18th, which turned out to be inaccurate. She's answered that question several times now.
Having a little trouble hearing you right now. Would you repeat it?
Sure. My point, Mr. Adjudicator, is the witness has answered this question. She's told Mr. Cooper that she doesn't know what contact tracing efforts took place after Mr. Norn inaccurately gave the date of April 18th of a visit to the legislature. She's answered that. She says she doesn't know what happened in terms of contact tracing in the day that followed before they had the accurate date. So I'd respectfully ask that we can move on to something else.
My response to that, sir, is simply that that's no longer the
Well, I
issue.
think that's a fair objection, though, if she said she doesn't know. She's been trying to be truthful with you.
And I,
But if she doesn't know, there's really nothing that can be done about it.
no, I understand that, sir, and I'm not relying on that. My questions are no longer about what she knows. I'm asking her now. She's identified 2 instances of alleged misinformation that resulted in more complications in her job than otherwise would be the case. So I'm asking her not about new information. I'm simply asking her to explain how, having had misinformation for something less than 24 hours, presumably, that complicated her work. That's all I'm asking. I'm not asking about what they did, but if she doesn't remember, then how can she draw the conclusion that that event...
Just one thing at a time. You have answered that you don't recall. Is that the situation with respect to that question?
I answered that I don't remember exactly what happened on that business day versus the next morning in response to that question.
And I'm simply asking, sir, then that she has to agree on the basis of her lack of memory that there's nothing about that particular incident that she can say complicated what their office does.
I think that's unfair. I think you can draw an inference in argument, but at the end of the day, she's indicated very clearly in respect to your question that she can't remember, and I think that's the end of it.
I'm content with that conclusion then, sir. Anything else? No. Okay. So those are all of my questions of this witness, and I appreciate your patience. I know this isn't easy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cooper. I'm going to ask Ms. Sparrow if she has any re-examination.
I do have just a couple questions for you. Again, thank you so much for your patience. So in response to Mr. Cooper's question about the racket club, you went through a list of actions that you would take once information is disclosed about a potential exposure, correct?
Correct.
And so had Mr. Norn, on April 21st, the first time he was contacted, had he accurately disclosed that he had been to the Legislative Assembly on April 17th, then would you have taken that action in contacting Legislative Assembly immediately?
Yes.
And so then Glen Rutland and the Legislative Assembly would have in fact been informed about that on April 21st. Is that correct? Had Mr. Norn disclosed that information?
We would have called and attempted to notify on the 21st. Whether someone answers our call is another thing, but attempts would have been made to make that notification immediately.
And on page 22 of the investigation form for April 17th, it talks about security guard Robert Brain, and it says, who writer has confirmed isolated. Is that correct?
Correct. So Robert Brain works at the Legislative Assembly, and when they found out that Robert was on shift at that time, they immediately sent him home and told him he should isolate and that public health would probably be calling him to follow up.
And so had Mr. Norn disclosed on April 21st about his visit to the Legislative Assembly, then Robert Brain could have isolated sooner. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So would you agree we're looking at potentially 2 days where Robert Brain was not isolating, that he could have been isolating had the correct information been provided by Mr. Norn?
If we had identified Robert Brain as a contact on that day, then yes.
All right. I just have a couple more questions. So would you agree, just looking over your investigation form, that the last addendum was added on April 23rd, 2021?
April 23rd. Yes.
So does that mean that the contact investigation was completed by April 23rd or at the end of April 23rd?
Let's confirm with the EMR entries. Yes, that looks yes, the 23rd.
So earlier, Mr. Cooper had asked you about several visit records dated from April 24th through to, I think, May 5th. And he asked you if you had spoken directly with the nurses responsible for compiling those visit records. Do you remember that?
I remember.
But those visit records don't actually form part of the investigation report, correct?
Some of these entries are for symptom checks, active daily monitoring.
Right. So the purpose of these calls was generally for the active daily monitoring and not the investigation report.
There's one entry on the 28th of April where a nurse called to notify him that he had a variant present on his swab. And then the
I see.
subsequent ones, there are some symptom checks, and then there's a final entry from me clarifying like a phone call that I had with Mr. Norn on May 5th.
But the information between April 24th and May 5th isn't included in the investigation form.
No, these are related to his disease management. So symptom checks and ending of isolation.
Okay, thank you. And my last question, so you had explained that the investigation goes back 14 days to from the positive test. Is that right?
That's correct. Or from symptom
So
onset.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. So in Mr. Norn's case, going back 14 days takes us to April 6th. Is that right? Maybe it would help on page 21, the first entry, it says day minus 14, April 6th.
Correct.
So by April 6th, Mr. Norn had returned from Grand Prairie, correct?
Correct.
So for the purposes of your investigation, you didn't really need to look into his activities in Grand Prairie.
That's correct. We don't follow people for isolation related to travel. That's not our role.
Okay. Okay, I think those are all of my questions. Again, thank you so much for your patience with us this afternoon.
Gilbert, on behalf of the inquiry, I'd like to thank you for all your assistance. It's never easy testifying, but you've been helpful, and we really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Mr. Barclay, we would propose an adjournment now to 9:30 tomorrow morning, at which time we will call Mr. Norn.
The inquiry will be adjourned until 9:30 tomorrow morning. I understand from my counsel that at that time he will be calling Mr. Norton.
Hey, Mr. Norn, do you acknowledge that?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We can adjourn then.
This hearing is adjourned until 9:30 tomorrow morning.
Thank you.